We are flying more than ever before.
During our trip, we took around 20 flights. It was like 15 tons of carbon that we created.
Our passion for plane travel is warming the planet.
Climate change is a really pressing issue, and we're absolutely clear that we have to reach net zero emissions by 2050.
Tonight, we investigate how the industry is trying to clean up its act.
Nappies, plastic, cardboard, we'll take that and we'll turn it into sustainable aviation fuel.
And ask how much can we trust their environmental promises.
You have to understand their motivation. They exist to make money.
We Brits are some of the world's most frequent flyers. 1 in 12 passengers on all international flights last year held a UK passport, more than any other nationality.
I've just come back from Las Vegas.
From Las Vegas?
How many times did you fly this year?
Probably 6.
6 times?
Yeah.
That's quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I never flew when I was little, so I'm making up for it now.
Probably 4 times a year.
And what kind of distances do you fly?
The further, the better.
It's all a far cry from the days of the first passenger flights when the rich and famous jetted off to exotic destinations. Back then, flying was glamorous, but expensive.
Fly with us to Chicago on Continental Airlines. We'll do a little more for you a lot faster to make this the nicest flight you've ever flown.
Today, we've embraced the era of cheap seats.
30 years of low fares, with over 200 destinations to choose from.
Worldwide, passenger numbers have quadrupled in 30 years. By 2037, they are expected to double again to 8 billion a year. Heathrow is Europe's busiest airport. Every day, around 200,000 people take off or land from here on 1,300 planes.
Heathrow is pretty close to capacity now. We're about 98%, 99% full, and it's been that way for some time. We think aviation is fundamentally a force for good in the world. It creates huge economic wealth for the UK and more broadly, but it also allows people to explore different parts of the world, visit friends and family overseas.
But all these journeys are polluting. They emit greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, gases responsible for global warming. And by 2050, as other industries reduce their emissions, aviation is expected to become the UK's biggest emitter.
If you added up the emissions of all the flights in the world, aviation would be a top 10 emitter. Aviation's emissions are projected to double, triple, potentially even quadruple in the coming decades as more and more big aircraft take to the skies.
Last year, Parliament approved a third runway for Heathrow. That could take its passenger numbers to 130 million a year.
That would make you, at the moment, the busiest airport ever. Is that really something that you should seek to achieve?
Well, firstly, that's a huge advantage for the UK, but we recognise we can't do that at any cost. We've got to meet noise targets, we've got to meet air quality targets, and we've got to meet carbon targets. Climate change is a really pressing issue, and we're absolutely clear that we have to reach net zero emissions by 2050, like every other part of the economy. That's what the science is telling us.
Our love of flying is a challenge to the UK's pledge to make dramatic cuts to emissions.
Now, the aviation industry is making big promises, saying it'll sort the problem out. So how do those promises stack up?
To find out, the team and I are going to have to take a few flights ourselves.
I've got to hurry, I'm one of the last passengers, as always.
First up, we're off to the border between Italy and Slovenia.
Venice.
On this return trip, 3 of us generated a total of 700 kilos of CO2, the same as the average household's monthly emissions. That's as a result of burning kerosene.
Now, you know that smell at the airport when you get close to the planes? That is kerosene, aviation fuel. It's a little bit oilier than petrol, but also contains loads of energy. Now, that is crucial for flying. Big planes like these take loads of energy to get them off the ground, and the fuel has to be portable because you've got to carry it with you.
But there's not a drop of kerosene in this plane. Its flights produce 0 emissions.
Oh, that is amazing.
That's it.
So is this the future? I'm in the world's first commercially available aircraft powered entirely by electricity.
Wow, that's lovely.
It uses rechargeable batteries that allow it to fly for an hour.
That's really exhilarating to fly.
But its use is limited.
So the issue with electric planes is the battery. The problem is you just can't pack that much power into a battery. Nothing like, woohoo, what you can with kerosene. Much more energy dense. So the problem is the range is less. And so is the capacity, just the two of us. Oh my God.
The plane has been bought mostly by flight schools to train pilots.
It's designed to do one thing very well. It's to cover the flight training segment. But it's not a universal solution. It would be feasible to do a battery-powered aeroplane with much longer range, however, it would not be cost-effective.
That's actually very smooth, isn't it?
Will passenger flights ever be as clean or green as these machines? The chief executive of Ryanair is sceptical about when battery-powered passenger planes will be available.
If the aviation industry had any alternative to jet kerosene, we would use it in a flash. Fuel last year accounted for nearly 30% of my cost base. But we don't have the alternative of electric batteries to get an aircraft off the ground. It doesn't have the propulsion.
If electric planes won't cut it anytime soon, how about alternative fuels made from this, your household waste? That's what British Airways and Shell want to do. They are investing millions into a company that wants to turn rubbish into jet fuel from 2024. They call it sustainable fuel.
Anything you throw in your black bag, so nappies, plastic, cardboard, food, anything that can't be recycled, we'll take that and we'll turn it into sustainable aviation fuel.
This fuel will avoid the polluting process needed to produce kerosene. And lots of the waste would emit greenhouse gases in landfill, so why not use it to power aircraft instead?
You can genuinely have the right effect by taking the carbon from a sustainable source. So over the life cycle, you've actually got a genuine carbon dioxide reduction.
Sounds good. But it still contributes to climate change, not least because emissions of CO2 from the engine will stay the same.
But just to be absolutely clear, when it's burnt in a plane, it's going to release the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions as current kerosene.
Yes, it is. It behaves exactly like current kerosene. So the greenhouse gas emissions at the plane are the same, but over the life cycle, they're much lower.
Initially, it's going to be expensive, and there'll be nowhere near enough of it for BA's planes. So it will be blended with ordinary kerosene, which will still make up more than half the final fuel.
It's just the start. What we'll then do is do it again and again and again until we can make a really big contribution to the UK's fuel demand.
The UK's leading expert on aviation emissions says new fuels could be the answer, but the industry is not moving fast enough.
So how far off are we from having a ready supply of sustainable fuels?
I think we're still decades away.
Decades away?
Yes. The aviation industry needs to take it a lot more seriously, and they need to be demanding that governments take policy measures that forces the whole system to produce zero carbon fuel, because that's the only way out.
And the longer we wait for low-carbon fuels, the more greenhouse gases we will emit, warming the planet. So is there anything we can do now?
This is what's wrong! This we need to change!
Some people are taking to the streets saying we should stop flying altogether. A new phrase has entered the language: flight shaming.
The Duke of Sussex and his wife have faced criticism after newspapers claimed they flew privately 4 times in 11 days over the summer.
Some celebrities have had to defend their behaviour.
But I don't fly nearly as much as I did because of my carbon footprint, and I plant a lot of trees.
Do you fly economy to kind of reduce your carbon footprint?
I bloody don't, no. Far too old for that.
It is making some of us look a bit closer at the impact of our flying, including Callum Taggart and Ellie Moore, who live on the Isle of Man.
So easy these days to book a flight, and they're so cheap. It's just how quickly can I get from A to B?
12 months ago, after years of saving, they took the holiday of a lifetime to South America.
During our trip, we took around 20 flights.
There's some pretty serious distances you have to travel to get anywhere. So with the time that we had and the kind of budget that we had, we've thought that the only way we could do it really was to fly.
Before our trip, I don't think we really thought about the environment at all. We were so excited about going to South America. It's been our dream since we met, probably that's like almost 7 years ago.
But while on their trip, they saw a glacier that had receded because of the changing climate. So when they got home, they calculated their CO2 emissions.
So 15, 16 to Bariloche, 17 to Mendoza.
And then the last one in Ternal is
18 to Santiago. We put in all our flights, and we also put in the bus journeys that we did take, and the difference in the carbon emissions was really quite significant.
I was actually astounded. It was like 15 tons of carbon that we created.
That's nearly double the annual emissions of the average UK household for all activities, flying included.
While being there made us realise that it probably wasn't the best thing to do for the environment.
And we now sound a little hypocritical.
Yeah.
They spent over £200 offsetting the impact of their flights. Offsetting is when you pay to compensate for your emissions with projects that remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere or reduce emissions elsewhere.
It makes you feel slightly better about what you've done and the flights that you've taken. Obviously, nothing is as good as not taking the flight in the first place, but paying a small amount towards your flights seems like a no-brainer.
We want to see how effective one of these carbon offsetting schemes is, and yep, it means taking another flight.
It's all just so routine now.
Ryanair is one of Europe's largest airlines, emitting millions of tons of greenhouse gases a year. Its boss says the airline is Europe's cleanest and greenest. It packs a lot of passengers onto its fleet of new, more fuel-efficient planes.
People flying with Ryanair have reduced their emissions by 50% compared to flying with most of Europe's other major airlines. In their behalf this year, we'll pay environmental taxes of over 630 million euros.
Ryanair has recently launched a voluntary carbon offset scheme. You can pay £1 or €1 at booking towards offsetting your carbon footprint and other environmental initiatives. That £1 supports 4 charity projects. One is a whale tracking scheme in Ireland. It may be worthwhile, but it doesn't claim to offset greenhouse gases. 2 involve planting trees, which do remove CO2 from the atmosphere. There's a 250-hectare site in Portugal and a smaller location here in Roscommon in Ireland.
So Porrig and I are off to see one of the last examples of ancient Irish woodland. Let's go.
Farmer Porrig Corcoran is taking me close to where the trees will be planted. Ryanair has helped an Irish charity buy 7 hectares of land. It's about the size of 10 football pitches.
The land's just out here on the other side. Lovely piece of good quality land. It'll grow fantastic trees.
The charity will plant thousands of seeds from the existing forest.
It's a great community project. It's an old ancient woodland, one of the rarest that's left in Europe now of an oak woodland. It's the DNA of Ireland.
They've taken this ancient woodland and they're growing more of it. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful. But if one of the objectives is to offset carbon, then there is a big problem. There just isn't enough of it.
The Irish scheme is really tiny. It's just 7 hectares. It's not even the size of a small farm.
We asked this academic to calculate the emissions the tree schemes in Ireland and Portugal would remove from the atmosphere.
They are woefully inadequate in terms of the scale of these schemes compared to the amount of emissions that are being generated from these flights.
He's estimated Ryanair's 2019 emissions using available data. He says for each of the next 20 years, the tree projects would offset less than 0.01% of this year's emissions.
It's a drop in the ocean. To me, that's a gimmick. It's a green gimmick rather than a serious attempt to slow down climate change.
To offset all of Ryanair's 2019 emissions by planting trees, they would have to cover about 12% of the UK.
The point here is that you've got a large and growing airline that emits a lot of carbon dioxide, and your offsetting scheme nowhere near
Absolutely
meets
wrong.
that. But there's an Irish forest, isn't there, in Roscommon, which is 7 hectares. I mean, it is nothing.
From little acorns grow mighty trees.
If you've only got 7 hectares, you're only going to get 7 hectares worth of mighty oaks, aren't you?
We've only started this in the last year. I mean, we're working with 4 projects. We're replanting trees in Monchique in Portugal. We're supporting whales and dolphins in Ireland as
project,
well.
which has nothing to do with carbon dioxide.
And the bizarre
which
one
has nothing to do with carbon dioxide.
No, but it's good for the environment.
Well, it's good, yeah.
I don't think any of our customers would object to supporting whales and dolphins in Ireland.
The Ryanair offset scheme also pays for fuel-efficient cook stoves in Uganda. This project offsets much more CO2 than the trees, but over a year, it's still only the equivalent of under a week of Ryanair's annual emissions.
This is a small programme that has started in the last year. All it does is a gesture. It's no more than that, and 3% of our passengers are good enough to contribute €1 per ticket to that programme.
Is a gesture, as you call it, adequate?
It's a donation. We don't claim that it offsets the entire value of your flight. You're still not happy. You still want to bitch about the scheme.
The truth is, you'd have to pay far more than £1 to make a substantial difference.
Can you really pay £1 and kind of absolve yourself of responsibility for the carbon emissions that you've created?
Not at all. That £1 probably wouldn't scale to the emissions from your flight. But secondly, you've still emitted a tonne of CO2 or 200 kilos of CO2, and that will be remaining in the atmosphere for hundreds of years to come.
But the principle of carbon offsetting remains appealing. It allows us passengers to feel less guilty and the airlines to continue to grow. And the industry believes it can work.
Time for another flight. We are in Montreal at the UN body that helps governments regulate the industry, the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. Here, after years of talks, countries are working on the small print of an offsetting scheme agreed for international flights. It is called CORSIA. Annie Petzonk took part in the talks for an environmental group.
The negotiations on CORSIA were very difficult, with some countries saying, we cannot meet a 2020 target. Our airlines need to grow in the future. And others saying, if we cannot limit the carbon dioxide emissions of our aircraft, the future of our industry is in jeopardy.
Merci beaucoup.
CORSIA was a political compromise between 193 governments
with input from the industry, reflecting some of the realities of the aviation sector. We actually think it's a very good deal because it has the buy-in from everybody.
Here's how it will work. Under the new deal, next year, participating countries will add up all their annual carbon dioxide emissions from international flights. Then, from 2021, when emissions go over that level, airlines will have to pay to offset them.
CORSIA has the potential to be a good scheme as airlines see that they're going to have to pay for carbon pollution for the first time ever. They are scrambling to find how to cut emissions inside their operation.
But critics say it is not nearly ambitious enough.
CORSIA is only designed to deal with the growth in emissions, so the vast majority of carbon dioxide won't be offset. What's more, lots of countries, including China and Russia, won't take part until 2027.
And some argue the very concept of offsetting is a problem. Campaigners like Andrew Murphy say it hasn't delivered in the past.
Offsetting is the most flawed climate tool. We've had about 20 years experience globally of trying to make offsetting work. And what we've had is wind farms that were going to be built anyway, trees that ended up being burnt down anyway. It's not working as a climate tool. But at the same time, aviation industry is increasingly seeing offsetting as essentially its get-out-of-jail card for climate policy.
ICAO said the offset scheme is just one of numerous measures states and industry are pursuing to limit emissions. But how committed are airlines to keeping emissions down? Panorama has been given details of an industry-wide practice that is at odds with their promises on climate change. A British Airways insider is prepared to blow the whistle on what he believes is an industry putting profits before the planet. He's worried speaking out will cost him his job, so wants to remain anonymous.
I believe them to be misleading passengers to think that British Airways is more sustainable than it actually is.
British Airways says it is investing in fuel-efficient planes and from next year will fully offset domestic flights.
We've set ourselves the vision to be the world's leading airline group on sustainability.
Over the last 3 years, our fuel efficiency programme has saved over 200,000 tonnes of CO2.
But our insider reveals an industry practice called tankering, which causes unnecessary emissions. It means some flights, mostly short-haul, carry more fuel than they need to reach their destination. Usually, it's to save money by not refuelling at airports where fuel is more expensive.
Ultimately, you have to understand their motivation. They exist to make money. Aviation is a very cost-aggressive industry, and any opportunity you can find to save or make money, you'll do so. And British Airways is no different.
But this cost saving has an environmental impact.
If you carry more fuel, the plane weighs more. You need to burn more fuel to transport it. So you get additional emissions of CO2 that otherwise would not have taken place.
If you imagine loading up your car for a school holiday with all the family and all the kids and all the suitcases in the back, you use more petrol to drive along the motorway. And flying is much the same.
The industry says it is doing everything it can to reduce weight in order to cut emissions.
Airlines are working on a daily basis to make the aircraft lighter, so new types of seats, new catering trolleys, removing paper from the cockpit.
BA even boasts it prints its in-flight magazine on lighter paper to save weight. But we have seen dozens of BA internal documents which show up to 6 tons of extra fuel have been loaded onto planes on short-haul routes.
So here's one example. This is a BA flight to Italy that loaded more fuel than it needed for the journey. Now, the extra fuel burnt to carry it generated 600 kilos of CO2. That's about the same as one person flying to New York and back.
That saved BA about 40 quid. It can be much more, but sometimes it can be as little as a tenner.
For such a big company such as British Airways to be trying to save such small amounts while emitting extra CO2 seems unjustifiable in the current climate.
Well, it sounds to me like hypocrisy.
It is. It's exceptionally hypocritical. I've been a BA employee for a long time. I'm very proud to be part of BA. But in all honesty, it makes me sad and disappointed.
BA's tankering led to 18,000 tonnes of additional CO2 last year. And it's not just BA. They say they're responsible for only 2% of the total emissions caused by tankering in Europe. And we've seen evidence EasyJet carries extra fuel in this way. The emissions from tankering by all airlines in Europe is the same as the carbon footprint of a town of 100,000 people.
So how easy would it be for airlines to stop tankering?
Well, we think very easy. It's clearly crazy that we burn unnecessary amounts of CO2, which on a per flight basis result in very small cost savings. But these seem to be some really easy wins that could be quickly fixed.
But when the savings are totted up, it is lucrative. It's estimated it saved airlines in Europe almost £230 million last year. BA said it is common industry practice for operational safety and price reasons. For them, it applies mainly to short-haul destinations with considerable fuel price differences between European airports. European flights are covered by the EU's emissions trading scheme. Group CEO Willie Walsh has now said the practice may be wrong and the policy will be reviewed. EasyJet says it takes place on a tiny proportion of flights for operational and commercial reasons, and it's reduced the level in recent years. Back in the Isle of Man, Callum and Ellie have decided how they're going to get to their next holiday destination.
So we thought, OK, where can we get by land? So that was the easiest thing, wasn't it? We thought, OK, let's go to Singapore by train. So that's what we're going to do next.
I think the train travel is quite exciting because it's not something we've done before, really.
But most of us who fly just want to carry on. Meanwhile, the industry wants to carry on growing.
We don't believe people want to fly less. Flying's really not the enemy in this whole debate. CO2 is the enemy.
But the aviation industry isn't doing enough to deal with the emissions it generates.
Here we've got a giant sector, aviation, that simply isn't facing up to its obligations, is it?
I think it doesn't know how to make the reductions at the pace required.
No, it's worse than that. It wants to go on growing.
It wants to go on growing, and it doesn't want to have measures that would impede its ability to keep on growing.
If we won't fly less and the industry's efforts aren't enough, the only option may be for governments to get tougher.
Ultimately, if we're going to solve climate change, it's going to come from the ambitious countries getting together and taking action on things like taxing aviation, on new fuels, on slowing growth, on blocking airport expansions.
What that means is, if nothing else works, it is likely to get a lot more expensive to fly.
Cleaning up your trainers and helping the environment? Right Foot Forward and Me versus Climate Change, streaming on BBC iPlayer. Power suits to boot, but only the ethical way. Podcast Fashion Fix is on BBC Sounds, so download the app now. The Royal Army Medical Corps breathe life into Gary Lineker's Grandad's War here on BBC One next.